Welcome to The Mountain Pass, a podcast about lifelong learning, curiosity, and our wonderful brain. Topics we love at Alp Audio. But this isn't a podcast about Alp, the product. Rather, it's conversations driven by our curiosity. Today, I'm speaking with Sophie Bailey, the founder and host of the EdTech podcast. Sophie has interviewed over 250 people in the EdTech industry over the past few years and is about to get started on a new venture. So naturally, I wanted to chat with her about all of those things, how to interview, what she's learned, and what's up next. Enjoy. Sophie, welcome to the Mountain Pass. It is great to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you very much. I know it's been a while trying to get this one sorted, so I'm really pleased to be here finally.
Yes, it definitely has. It's interesting for me to be on the other side of the mic because usually you are the one who interviews other people on the EdTech podcast. So what's it like being on the receiving end?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I like it. We'll have to keep chatting, and then I just love asking questions. That's just the nature of my curious mind, I think. So but that's the nature of a podcast anyway. I can still ask the questions back and forth.
Exactly. You can feel free to ask me anything and cut me off if I get long-winded. But let's start with the EdTech podcast because you've been around the industry, the EdTech industry, for a while. I think you were in Bet UK, kind of head of content back in 2014, 2015.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've been doing this podcast for a while. So I would just love to hear about the podcast in general. What made you start it? What were the early days like? What is it like now? What's changed? What do you enjoy? What's difficult? Anything and everything about the podcast. And then from there, maybe we can dive into like EdTech specifically.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, my background prior to launching the podcast was in events. So I used to work in technology events and any sector that sort of converged with technology. So whether that was sort of smart cities or what was then mobile payments or mobile healthcare, and launching events and creating them and launching them around the world. And my last role in that sector was, as you say, head of content at Bet, which was a very large educational technology show. And so we were lucky enough to have Sir Ken Robinson come and speak at that event. But it was just a great way. I think we had 11 stages and 500 speakers. So a great way to sort of really immerse yourself into the educational technology sector and also into the different segments, so the user groups within that. So whether that be sort of schools or K-12 for your American listeners, or more into higher and further education and the workplace. And the story behind launching the podcast was essentially I was on maternity leave, and like many other people in that situation, I wanted to kind of keep my hand in the sector and keep abreast of all the developments whilst I was off. So I'd listen to podcasts whilst pushing my baby around Hackney Marshes then, and I noticed that there were two main podcasts at the time around education and technology. So there was the TES podcast, which was sort of a weekly reflection on news, primarily for teachers in the UK. And then there was the EdSurge podcast, which was primarily really about deal flow and investors and startups and sort of the business side of things, and that was primarily looking at the US. And I've always been someone that's interested in the sort of in-between spaces. Even going back to school, if I think about it, I didn't ever want to be in one group or the other, but would quite happily sit across different groups, and that's kind of like where I'm most happy. So I thought there was value in creating a podcast that shared best practice between both of those groups, and also moved away from a slightly lazy idea. So from startups thinking about schools, like why don't they ever pilot my thing, and from schools thinking about startups, oh, all they ever want to do is make money and they don't care about learners. And I thought both of those notions were a little bit unfair on each side, and actually they were both pulling towards the same mission. So, I thought about that, and I was thinking more broadly about what content meant, and I knew it meant more than just speaking at events. And so I was interested at the time in infographics and podcasts, and so I took myself on a couple of courses privately, and eventually I just took the plunge. I just went out and bought some kit, and then over my birthday week with our young child, I spent a few days in a random cottage somewhere. I can't remember where it was now. I think it was near Glastonbury, and binged on a load of YouTube videos after doing a sort of how to launch podcasts 2 hour in-person meet, and learned how to use Audacity, and essentially went back and handed in my notice and just thought, and that sounds very easy. There were a lot of I think with many people you kind of get to a point, and I'd kind of decided that I needed to keep learning and growing, and so it was very terrifying, but also very very exciting at the same time, and kind of that's how it started. But I should probably come up for breath at that point, but I can kind of go into some of the complexities thereafter.
Yes, yes. So I had two questions that popped up, and then we can go into the complexities that you had in mind. One of them is a complete non sequitur, which is just kind of the foundation story of you kind of pushing the stroller around or the baby carriage. Um, I'm wondering if, when we did market research for Alp, one of the most relevant demographics that we found was really parents on paternity and maternity
Mm,
leave, because there is a fear of not keeping up with the workforce or with what's going on at work, and needing to upskill. On the other hand, it's also a time when a lot of people transition careers, because you
yep.
have 3 to 6 months at home and you're thinking about what's next. On the other hand, you are incredibly, incredibly busy with, especially if it's your first child, when it's completely overwhelming. So I guess in general, just what are your thoughts on audio content and learning for that time?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm a great believer that maternity or paternity, um, or if you're not having children, any kind of break, sabbatical, or other version of that, is a really fertile time for new ideas. So, um, I think when we reflect on what's happening at the moment with the Great Resignation, much of that comes from people being out of their general routine, and that they are able to reflect on what they want from life, and basically have more free time and more free headspace to kind of mull over that, and make some inquiries, and sort of jot those thoughts down, as it were. Um, in terms of being time poor, um, yeah, I'm a huge believer in audio as just such a great mechanism to learning. And it's interesting that you said that there's a sort of fear in those times of falling behind. The reality is it really depends on the individual, because if you're someone that's motivated to learn, and you're listening to 3 or 4 different podcasts about various aspects of learning, versus someone that um, sort of perhaps just does, it's the kind of McGregor's X and Y theory, isn't it? You could have someone that's just plodding into the workplace, doing the bare minimum. So it really comes down to personal agency, and that's just what I love about podcasts. They aren't top down, necessarily kind of delivered or advocated by an organization. You can learn anything you want to, and yeah, I think they're great. I spoke to someone today, sorry, this week, who we were talking earlier about kind of next steps and in terms of what I want to do. And she reached out and she said, "Oh, I listen to your podcast and I listen to it when I'm on the treadmill." And I just thought it's brilliant, and yeah, I think it's a far more human-centered design than having to be sat at a desktop, at a laptop. Um, and yeah, I'm a big fan. And just going back to the first point, I think having regular um, points to just reflect, that's where so many great ideas come up. So yeah, I love that. I love that time. And it's happened again now. I had a lockdown baby in April 2020, and here I am sat basically planning a new venture for next year. So there's definitely something in that.
Yeah, time to reflect with a new baby gives you opportunities for the future. So I'll ask you in a bit about that new venture. But first, I wanted to zoom back to starting the podcast, which you described very eloquently. I was wondering, though, about the challenge to start something new, because at least for me, and I'll speak personally, getting off the ground and actually putting something out there is terrifying, and constantly have the fear of it's not good enough and re-editing and re-editing and re-editing. And even this podcast, which launched, and I wasn't quite sure of who I want to interview and what will be interesting for me or for people who are listening, but taking that step forward and just doing something, because
Hmm.
often doing anything is better than doing nothing, even if it's not the perfect kind of product. So I was just wondering on your how that felt, if you remember.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with the doing something is better than doing nothing. I think, you know, uh, I think there's so much fear around startups, and then when you stand back and think about them and take away some of the excesses of sort of startup culture, which I think puts people off as well. What it comes down to is the world in which we live is constantly changing, and there are new challenges, and therefore we need to come up with new ideas. And, why shouldn't that be an idea that you come up with, that you go and find a team and you develop up? And there will always be kind of funding for new ideas which solve problems. So, sort of taking it back to that very basic kind of structure of why it's needed is sometimes refreshing. And then I like to think of it as the sort of Turner Prize. Everyone goes along to the art gallery and they say, "Oh, I could do that. I could put that horse dung there," but they don't. And actually, um, your I think perfection is a complete fallacy. I think if you look at evolution and how um, sort of genetic errors are part of that step towards evolution, and perfection is just sort of an unattainable goal. So once you kind of get over that, I think great things can happen. And I think I've also been reflecting on where some of these ideas that we give ourselves around perfection come from. And I think, if you go to school and you're encouraged to get, A stars, and then you're encouraged to get a first, because ultimately it's that not a gateway drug, but it's like, the thing that will allow you to pass, go collect your £200 and get onto the next level. And that's fine in a kind of short term or near term way of thinking about things. But when you're in your late 20s, or when you're in the part of your life where perhaps you experience the inevitable major life event where you have to slow down, or where things aren't perfect, or where just achieving that level of cramming and trying to be 100% all of the time, um, it's not sustainable, and it doesn't bode well in terms of personal well-being and all those things. So I think there's some ways that we can kind of address that right from the off. And it's not to say, quash aspirations. It's more, I think, just a more holistic approach at looking at our creativity and our attributes. So um that's that one. And then will you remind me go back to to starting the podcast, that's right. So I don't know, I think I felt quite comfortable with the idea of launching things from scratch. I think one thing the event sector instills in you is really what you're doing over and over again is coming up with an idea, validating it with your market, creating a brand, uh, essentially creating an experience and a product out of thin air. So when you've been doing that for 10 years, the idea of essentially just changing the medium in which that is conveyed, the actual act of starting from scratch wasn't too intimidating. I would put a caveat on that, which is that with the EdTech podcast, I had some savings that I had kept back, and the whole thing was bootstrapped. So my next venture that I'm thinking about will require the traditional sort of investment path, and that for me is like more the sweaty hand time, because it's kind of relying on others in a way that it's not about perfection, but it is about extending who you are relying on in order to make that work, whether that's in terms of who's funding it or co-founders or a scaled team. So, but yeah, I think once you get over this idea that perfection is something, that you have to deliver, and actually it's about listening, and it's about, as long as people know that you're listening and taking their needs on board, I think that's the main thing. And being personable, it goes so far to just know that there's sort of a human face to anything that you're developing, and a sort of person that is approachable and accessible is really important as well, I think.
Right. So I think there's a lot there that connects to actual learning, in terms of also just taking the step and going forward. And I think what you said specifically about how nothing is ever perfect, and kind of stepping up is the first step. So if we kind of pursue that tangent down the road of education and learning, you can take this in any direction you want, but I'm wondering what you've learned, or kind of one or two highlights from what you've learned in either just doing the podcast for so long, either about business or about being a creator, or alternatively from interviewing so many people about the educational world, like anything in that area.
Yeah, I mean, probably what I'd want to do is reflect on, chatting to 250 people plus from around the world on both
Sounds
the
like
education.
a great title for a blog post or a book.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean that's an interesting thing. I think for me, first and foremost, in terms of personal learning, it's again, it's retaining that sense of agency. So, the amount of people going independent or freelance in the US is kind of skyrocketing, and I think now with the digital age, you have the tools to to connect people, to add value, and to do that in a way that is kind of aligned to your own personal goals as well. So for me, after a couple of years, I was working flexibly, part-time, working really hard, but probably after a couple of years, I was already earning the same kind of remuneration as previously, but I had far more time to spend on my own personal, things that spoke to me personally. And after speaking to 250 people, I think there's been some really interesting shifts in EdTech, and I think these are actually really positive. So when I started out, there was a huge clamor around personalized learning, using machine learning and AI to sort of nudge learners kind of along this optimized path, and to create a sort of really frictionless experience. And I think our understanding of the more social learning elements is greater now. So instead of seeing how fast you can go, it's now about, okay, how how do we create this as a more sort of human learning experience? So making it more collaborative, making it more creative, perhaps having smaller cohorts, perhaps doing things that are also taking into account the learner's well-being. And I think that's a really positive thing. And I think that trend has also been accelerated by the worst excesses of our experiences during the pandemic as well. And just to jump on the back of that as well. I think in the beginning, again, there was a very siloed approach to what should be learnt. So, the sort of the industrial 4.0 is coming, everyone must learn coding. If you don't learn coding, you're not gonna earn you're not gonna have a job, and these kind of narratives. And now again, I think people realize, well, hang on, there's real value in what humans can do that computers can't do, and computers can do very well narrow tasks that we sort of gear them towards. But if we try and compete against computers in terms of computation, we're setting ourselves up for a failure. Whereas if we, really tap into what makes us human, our creativity, our ability to think outside the box, then, those aspects are actually really interesting. So you're seeing far more innovations that are about, interdisciplinarity between, science and the arts, or, real world problem solving. And again, I think that's a really positive development. So yeah, I think those would be some of my musings on the kind of some of the big shifts in edtech in terms of uh what's being developed. I think for me with the podcast, it's just a huge privilege to talk to so many people and to learn almost by osmosis, just kind of somewhere in the back of my head, this stuff's all going in, and hopefully not getting pushed out the other side. But yeah, like, in terms of book recommendations, in terms of how people are thinking about problem solving, that is an absolute privilege. I think, like any technology, it's always evolving. So you've got things now like Clubhouse and Twitter Spaces, and I'm just really excited about the potential for audio. And I think it's going to be, it will stick around for a long time. I don't think it's going anywhere soon.
I agree. I think it's just getting better and better. I'm torn between asking you about agency in education and learning, because I think that's a theme that's so important, and asking you about learnings as an interviewer. So it's something that I'm very much interested in, and I haven't found a lot of good resources on, which is, how do you actually interview people better? So I guess I'll give you the agency to decide which one of those.
Well, I kind of reflected on this myself. I think it was a year before last. And the book that I did come up with was Emily Maitlis. Do you know her? The BBC.
No.
I think she's interviewed pretty much like all the top tech CEOs, a lot of the top political leaders of the world, and she was famous for interviewing Prince Andrew. Anyway, she has a book. I'm trying to remember what it's called now. It's called Airhead. That's what it's called. Because and again, it goes back to this idea of perfection. So, as the interviewer, how do you, you've probably had this where you have a really fantastic guest and you're thinking, and sometimes you can over prepare. I've definitely done that, where you have reams and reams of information, and actually, in some ways that's good because it's there in your back pocket, but actually sometimes the most simple questions like open up the biggest discussions. So it's hard because you want to show that you've researched your subject, but you don't want to kind of make it so detailed that it kind of closes down the answer. Anyway, so her book is is fantastic. It's sort of reflecting on 10 or more years of really high profile interviews and how they went. And what it comes down to is that she's reflecting on how every interview is a balance between, being prepared, the circumstances of the recording, and then, almost like a kind of barter between what they want to give up at that moment and how it can be positioned. And there's just like there's so many different factors. So and even one of the most skilled people for interviewing in the whole world, ultimately, if that person's had a bad day, or she may have flown halfway around the world and then basically they can't do the interview. So I found that really encouraging in a way, because you sometimes you do think, oh, I wish I'd asked them this, or you find out something retrospectively. And I think it all helps, though. All of the research that you do for an interview is useful learning anyway. Again, it's that balancing act between what you have time to prepare for, and if you're doing also the editing, promotion, researching of other guests, that can factor in as well. But yeah, and then the other thing that I've started to do is have a guest form, trying to mirror the process that Desert Island Discs use, which essentially lays out some questions for guests to try and get them to synthesize some of their thoughts. So their big idea in education, or which foe or myth in educational technology they'd like to get rid of. And I've got like a few different questions, and basically I just say to them, fill out the ones that speak to you. And yeah, sometimes that's quite good in terms of at the start of a recording, just to relay some of that, and push people a bit to kind of reflect on what they thought when they wrote that down, what was behind their thinking. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's, I think, 900,000 podcasts launched in 2020, and what percentage of them did a journalism degree? What percentage of them did a podcasting course, or and in terms of the content? And I think it's a huge learning curve, and hopefully, like before, you start and you get your 3 episodes out, and then you listen back to them like 5 years later and think, oh my god. But you just got to start and keep developing. And I think curiosity is a wonderful thing, because if you're genuinely curious and actually just asking those really sometimes quite basic questions is a good thing, because you're learning. And then I think sometimes the worst thing you can do is now there's quite a bad habit of people wanting to over prepare before the recording, and so then it sounds too flat, whereas actually you want those moments of genuine revelation and interest as well.
Yeah, I wonder, I think the same question you could be asked just about teaching in general, right? Today, how many online teachers have a degree in education or have taken a course on teaching? I know I certainly haven't. And I founded an education app, and I often find myself embarrassingly not knowing something that if I'd only taken any single course, I would have known it, right? I think there's a lot of things that I don't know. And it's definitely been a steep learning curve over the past 3 years. On the other hand, when I look at a lot of courses and people who teach out in the world on online, and they don't have any credential, and they do a wonderful job, right? Often better than the credentialed ones. And so I have 2 parts in my mind that kind of argue about this. And I feel the same is true for podcasting. There's a lot that people can do really well. I know definitely for myself, like it's much harder than I anticipated. I'll put it that way. Also preparing, also trying to lead a conversation, but just like you said, not overbearingly, trying to keep everyone's interests in mind, whether it's the person I'm interviewing, myself with the things that are interesting to me, the audience, and actively listening while also thinking about the macro. Basically, you have to kind of have your head be in two places at one time.
Oh yeah, and I think, in the internet age, you've always got the voices of the trolls saying, "Oh, well, you should have asked this," or "Yeah, but that person that you're interviewing did this wrong." And I really believe in this idea that, if you go back to our chimp state, that we can only really cope with about 150 connections. And, some of these things always get rubbish by sort of pseudoscience, but like the reality is we're not developed to comprehend all the macro things that are going on in the world. And people are really feeling that now. And all of the different opinions and voices. And the reality is like, there will always be detractors. There will always be, and it is a dialogic process of, putting something out there, an opposing force moving forward, but actually sometimes it's quite hard to try and block that noise out, that kind of criticism and stuff. But you kind of, ultimately, for me, I think you just have to focus on the joy of the conversation. For me, why podcasts are brilliant, the ones that are really good, is because they tap into that sort of slightly covert conversation you might have after a conference. Maybe you're still at the conference, but you just sat to one side, maybe you're in the pub, but it's the bit where, you're actually really candidly reflecting on things, and connecting, and you can read someone's body language, and that may be visually, but it may also be an auditory thing. So, you can hear the excitement in someone's voice. So, yeah, I think you just have to try and cut some of that stuff out.
I think learning becomes relevant and concrete when you actually apply it in real life. That's when what you've done in kind of that amorphic world connects the real life and it's tangible. So what are you taking forward? I guess this is the time to ask about your next venture, and what are the lessons learned from the past few years? How are you applying that to your next venture, and what are you thinking about for your next venture?
Yeah, I mean, just to reflect, just to go back slightly on your past question as well. I think, you were talking about um, that mix of qualified teaching and then people that just happen to be really gifted in delivery. And I think I'm a big believer in this idea of sort of, multiple intelligences, and you can have someone qualified to the teeth, and I would like to see that, much more of that here in the UK around sort of teaching. So this, this real elevation of the teaching sector and professional development around it, like you have in Singapore or somewhere like that, where people are empowered to learn and train to the very highest level, and then the respect that they receive as a result, and at the time they are gifted for that, is kind of baked into their working practice. So, I'm a huge believer that our educational sector should benefit from that, and we need much more of it. That said, I think there are other people who are hugely gifted in connecting and sharing ideas, who perhaps don't know some of the philosophy behind it, but may be very talented in another way. So I'm just reflecting on one of my guests this year, which was Jamie and Moore from Cosmic Yoga. And that's a very early years application for yoga and well-being for sort of primary school age, but it's got a huge following, had big traction during lockdown, as you'd expect, and a big following on YouTube and that kind of thing. But one thing that she really spoke to me about, and she's really inspired by some of the best sort of children's television presenters from the 1950s to the 1980s, and how she mentioned two, one in the US, one here, but how they speak right down the camera at you. And I found this really fascinating in the age of, our educators being placed on online in online learning environments without perhaps pedagogical training specifically for online learning. And she has like an amazing connection down the lens herself, and she's got an acting background, and so she talked about pitch, pace, pause, power, and tone. And so yeah, so I think, you know, in this age of outreach and communications, and the best parts of that are these kind of examples, but the worst excesses of it are the sort of noise that comes with it and being able to cut through that. But yeah, so I think the conclusion being that, you know, you can draw on amazing pedagogical frameworks and specifically around online learning for this, and I'd like to see more of that. But also we should be elevating our best communicators, and you can see the importance of this in science outreach. You know, you can have a fantastic science development unless you have that person that is really gifted with connecting with the public or communicating on kind of really popular communication channels. Those ideas will sort of fall by the wayside or just be in the, you know, peer-reviewed journals, but like not have that greater impact. So I think that's my reflection on that, and yeah, and hopefully we will see both sides of those things rise up. So both the kind of traditional route, but also allowing others that are just gifted in communication to also use those skills for the benefit of learning.
Are you going to be using like that framework in your, like as an entrepreneur now? And that was what pitch. I had it in my mind for a second. It's pitch,
pitch, pace, pause, power, and tone.
Pitch, pace, pause, power, and tone. Okay, so are you going to be using pitch, pace, pause, power, and tone?
Well, you know, I think especially as a podcaster, it's quite important. I think, well, so probably it's probably less important in my next venture. So the reason being is that is more of a marketplace. However, in terms of communicating that to the many people that will need to come along on that journey to make it successful, then yeah, absolutely.
Right,
but yeah, shall I
as a marketplace, you need to communicate to double the people. You need the supply and you need the demand. So I think communication is probably one of the most important aspects.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, I never like to take the easy route, so why not? But yeah, so no, the general premise of the idea is that you know, prior to our current experiences, if we think about corporates and how they sort of attract and retain their best talent and also embed some of their company culture, they had the benefit of these really lovely, exciting office spaces, quite often in the big cities, often garnished with a lovely ping pong table or something like that. And obviously that whole world is changing for a lot of companies, and they now have the challenge of how to attract and retain their best talent, but also how to embed company culture and also make sure that there is a culture of empathy and sort of well-being for their staff. And so one of the models that seems to be emerging to support this new way of working are these quarterly meetups, where a company would go and find a great location and have their sort of R&R and also have a chance to embed their company culture and their values and increase connections and knowledge sharing between their employees. So what I want to build is essentially an education as a marketplace solution. So a SaaS platform, which if you imagine something like Airbnb, but with a integrated menu of reskilling options. So if you're the head of talent at a corporate, you could go onto this platform. You can book your venue, but you can also book and bolt on modules on, perhaps it might be neurodiversity training, perhaps it might be empathy building, remote leadership. And some of these would be delivered on site by best of kind of workshop and coaching experts. And some of it would be a sort of wraparound of best of EdTech for the rest of the year in sort of remote settings. And so if you're an employee, you go down to one of these amazing venues, and you would have a morning of learning and take on board that sort of social learning aspect that we talked about earlier. And then you might have an afternoon of just like amazing R&R where you get to sort of really think over some of those aspects. So, that could be surfing, it could be menu tasting, a spa, that kind of thing. And then the purpose of the venture is that, if you think about rural and coastal areas where quite often some of these great venues are, there's been a sort of very legacy brain drain of great thinkers and doers up to some of the big cities. And then for everyone in the regions as well, you've got an overdependence on sort of cyclical hospitality, tourism, agriculture. So this has always been an issue. Like, I grew up on the Isle of Wight and I've kind of seen it myself. And I think there's an amazing opportunity now to kind of tap rural and coastal areas into this knowledge economy and retaining some of the value of that. So the phase 2 of this venture would be taking some of the experts and learners and digital thinkers in those regions and plugging that talent into this marketplace as well. So yeah, it's another big adventure, and it's for me, it's I've kind of started something on my own with the EdTech podcast, but it was very much sole trader, and this will be another big kind of learning curve for me. And so I'm learning lots every day and on the lookout for a potential co-founder and those kind of things. But yeah, I think it's as awful as the pandemic is, and as much as it keeps throwing curveballs our way, I think as we've talked about at great length across the sector, it is opening up new ways of doing things and new opportunities as well. So yeah, I'll see what 2022 brings my way.
Love it, love it. And so if there is a prospective co-founder, someone who knows how to code, loves long walks on the beach, and it's a pleasure to work with.
It sounds like a sort of dating.
Oh, it is so much a dating thing. Where can they find you? Where can they reach out to you? Where can people follow along with what you're going to be building and with the EdTech podcast in general?
Yeah, sure. So if they go to the edtechpodcast.com, and there's an about page there, and if anyone's also listening in and they are one of those 900,000 people that launched a podcast in 2020, then I'm kind of aware that some of them may be then thinking, well, how do I keep this going and make money to keep it going? So I've just launched a reflection on my 5 years of how to commercialize a podcast. So there's a kind of audio course there, which we should chat about as well, about collaboration on that front. But yeah, so it's all there. It's all on the edtechpodcast.com, and yeah, that's where they can find me.
So I will put links to that in the show notes, especially I'm curious about the podcast collaboration. But Sophie, thank you so much for coming on the Mountain Pass.
Thank you so much. And yeah, have a great rest of your year.